Some of the early papyri here, and then we can get into some of the King James stuff, and just laying the background. It's the only way to have a meaningful understanding. It's what's missing in the vast majority of the debates that take place is enough background to be able to analyze the claims that are being made. That's why I made the comment, and someone asked last evening, I made the comment, King James onlyism is not a debate in academia, and that's not because I'm saying academia is unbelieving and all the rest of that stuff. I'm simply saying to people who know what the issues are, it's not an issue. It would never have been an issue to the King James translators. They never would have believed any of that stuff. And so if you lay the proper foundation, then these types of misunderstandings sort of evaporate on their own. On the screen right now, looking rather small for some reason, it's a lot bigger on my screen, is P45. And P45, I call it my manuscript. It's what I'm studying in depth at the moment. Primarily, initially my goal was to be focused upon the manuscript and its readings until well, that's when I encountered CBGM and came to realize that you simply can't do anything in New Testament textual studies today without dealing with CBGM. It's just, you're not going to get published, you're not going to accomplish anything. It's here, and it's sort of like, I'm sure there were people that preferred horses to cars initially, but, and for a while they sort of competed with each other, but if you stuck with the horse and buggy forever, you'd now be Amish. So that really wouldn't work out too well. And so my emphasis had to shift from just looking at this particular manuscript and its readings and what it might tell us to utilizing this particular manuscript because of its unique nature as somewhat of a test case. It is unique in that this is from the Gospel of John. This is one of the few fragments we have, John 10 and 11, are the largest fragments we have in P45, so you can see pretty much how large it was initially. It's an extremely unusual manuscript for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is it's the only Gospels manuscript we have that originally had Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. P75, P66, they were just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They did not include Acts. And so it's very unusual along those lines. Secondly, the scribe was not trying to do what the scribe of P75 was doing, letter by letter. It was definitely phrase by phrase. And there are times when the scribe just said, you know, that's not the way to say that. And so there are unique readings, almost editorial, yeah, that's not how that should be phrased type sections. You can recognize them, however. And so it's from around the year 220. Like I said, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, but only portions thereof. So I had been doing a sermon series for a long time. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that in the future, but I had been doing a sermon series for a long time based on P45, where if it contains any portion of a chapter, I preached that chapter. So it made for a rather intriguing way of doing things. But this particular manuscript, as I said, around 220, and it's rather unique, and it does shed some interesting light on the early portion of the text. But I am in danger of spending too much time on it because I've spent so much time with it. So I will move on. Have any of you been to the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin? Okay, just one person. Okay, well, congratulations again. If you ever get a chance to go there, I highly recommend it. It's not just biblical manuscripts, so they have some pretty impressive biblical manuscripts. There's all sorts of stuff there to see. And Dublin's a fascinating city as well. This is a P46. You can see by now, you guys are experts. You can sort of see the standard papyrus shape of an ancient book. You can see the spine would have been on the left, and then the upper corner on the right, and lower corner on the lower right. And you can sort of see where the damage has taken place over the years. P46 is on display in the Chester Beatty Library there in Dublin. This particular piece I saw when I was there. Thank you. That was good, thank you. And what makes this unusual is that's Pros Philippesius to the Philippians, so this is the earliest collection we have of Paul's writings. And as such, it's extremely important, theologically speaking, everything else. They did have Philippians out when I was there. I've told the story a number of times. I won't get down on the ground like I normally do. It's because I would probably then curl up in a ball and fall asleep, so I don't want to do that. So, but when we were there, we literally got down on our hands and knees to be able to read it, because the light, the way it was, it's very, very subdued light, obviously. And it's a very special light because you don't want to destroy the ink and fade it. But since it's coming from above at an angle, the best place to then read the manuscript is down here someplace. It's very, very difficult to read otherwise, but you could. And the security guards did not like the fact that it looked like we were worshiping the manuscripts on our knees. So they came to investigate what we were doing. So once again, I almost got myself kicked out of trying to read manuscripts. But the thing that bugged me is I really wanted to see the Carmen Christi, Philippians 2:5 through 11 in P46. I have it. I have pictures of it. But it's sort of like I've been trying to explain to a certain friend of mine who will remain nameless, even though he's wearing weird pants, that seeing the beauties of God's heavens, the Orion Nebula, Albireo, galaxies like the Andromeda Galaxy that is hurtling toward us at over 1 million miles per hour, and billions of years down the road will collide with the Milky Way galaxy. It will be a very interesting thing. But since galaxies are mainly empty space, it won't really do that much. But these things, you can see beautiful images from the Hubble telescope and stuff like that. We're about to launch in a couple of years a new one, which will go way, way, way beyond Hubble, and that's all exciting stuff. And we just landed the InSight lander and all the rest of that kind of stuff. But you can see beautiful images online from Hubble. But it's just not the same for seeing it yourself through the scope. When you are the one out there normally freezing yourself to death at a high altitude, because you finally found a clear, dark sky, and you're looking at these galaxies and things like that. It's not the same thing as looking at something on your screen or on a piece of paper. And he just doesn't get it. And it's the same thing here. I can look at these images, and they're very high quality images, and I can zoom in on them and the whole 9 yards. Probably see them better than I could at Chester Beatty, but I'm awful glad I saw them at Chester Beatty. And I wanted to see the Carmen Christi. Unfortunately, that page was there backwards, so they had the other side displayed. And so I knew it was on the other side of that piece of papyrus, but I unfortunately couldn't see it, which was a bit of a bummer. But it is displayed there. Now, some of you who were here a couple of years ago know what I'm about to do. And I just like doing this just for the fun of it. It's given me sort of a running tally over the years. But since this is the earliest collection we have of Paul's writings, you know that there is a great, tremendous, you okay? You know what I'm going to ask. Okay, good. Would you like to, because I'm tired, I'll stretch out here. You all come on up, and we'll run through this. There's a great debate over the authorship of one New Testament book called the Book of Hebrews, because it doesn't have a name attached to the document, unless you have the King James Version of the Bible, which says the Epistle of Paul to the Hebrews, and therefore it's all settled for you. But the reality is that was an editorial addition at a later point, though I have had some King James only advocates absolutely certain that was God's way of revealing the authorship of Hebrews, was that the King James, because the King James is a re-inspiration of Scripture anyways, it says that Paul was the author. So an obviously somewhat relevant question would be, does P46 contain Hebrews. Because if it doesn't, then you've got a manuscript from around the year 200 where the scribe evidently would not have viewed Paul as the author. And if it is included, then evidently at least that scribe did believe that Paul was the author of Hebrews. And so what I have done for literally decades now is I ask my audiences. I say, so how many of you think that P46 contains Hebrews? And exactly 2 people raised their hands. You need to raise your hand for me to see. So how many think it contains Hebrews? How many think it does not contain Hebrews? Okay, that was about 25% of you. So the rest of you obviously don't like me. The rest of you obviously are sitting there going, you can't make me do this. I'm autonomous. I do not have to vote. Because I'm afraid that if I do vote and I get it wrong, you're going to mock me because you're a mean, terrible, horrible, nasty person. I've heard about you. Your reputation has preceded you. And so I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to hope you don't look at me because I'm not going to vote. So how many of you did not vote? Yeah, see? See what I mean? And even when I tell people beforehand, I've begged audiences, please, don't diss me. Don't make me unhappy. Just go, no one's going to mock anyone. Just go ahead and vote. I will still have people just sit there, no, I'm not going to do it. I was in a church in Zambia when Voti Balcom had me over earlier this year to do some lectures at African Christian University where he's the chancellor. There was a Reformed Baptist church in Zambia that had me in to speak, and I talked on textual issues. And nobody voted on anything, period. It is cultural. I mean, if you expect any kind of participation, reaction, facial exchange, an amen, anything, you are not going to get it. They're just going to sit there and stare at you. And you can be preaching your lungs out, and they're just going to sit there and stare at you. It is just a cultural thing. If you feed off of the audience, you're dead. You will starve. It's all over with. They just sat there. They may have appreciated it. I don't know. You have no way of finding out. They didn't say anything at all. So, yeah, even when I ask people, there will still be those that sit there and go, So for the few of you who are my friends who voted one way or the other, yes, P46 does contain Hebrews right after Romans, in fact. So what does that tell us? That tells us that someone around the year 200 believed that Paul wrote Hebrews. Is that conclusive? No, it's not. And in fact, from my perspective, it could be they held the same theory that I do. My theory, by the way, is that Paul preached Hebrews in Hebrew or Aramaic. And when Luke heard it, Luke asked to render it in Greek. Because it's not Paul's style. It's not Paul's vocabulary. It's Paul's theology. But it's not his language. It's not his syntax. It's not his grammar. It's not how he writes. It's how Luke writes. And anybody who teaches Greek knows that if you want to make sure that no one ever gets past the very first year of Greek, introduce them to Hebrews. Because it, along with Luke and Acts, is the hardest Greek in the New Testament by any stretch of the imagination. That's why you start with 1 John, not with Hebrews. If you like your Greek students. If you happen to hate your Greek students, then you go ahead and start with Hebrews, and that'll pretty much make sure they're going to become Hebrew scholars rather than Greek scholars. So, anyways, so there's P46, and it is an important document as well. I am a geek. This is P91. What's interesting about P91, I am holding P91 in my hands there. This is at Macquarie State University outside of Sydney, Australia. And that is 1/3 of P91. The other 2/3 are in a museum in Italy. And Macquarie State University and the museum in Italy argue about who should send who the other part of the same fragment. But it is interesting that if you're able to look, you can see right there is a nomina sacra. So you can tell that it is a Christian fragment. It's from the book of Acts. Acts 2 and 3. And some people theorize that it's cut the way it's cut because it had been folded up and made almost a magic amulet to where it was like folded up and then put into something you'd wear, like a headband type thing. And so just like when you take a piece of paper, sometimes you want to cut something, you don't have scissors or a knife or something like that, fold it up and make it real tight, then you can separate it real easy. That's what happened to the papyri in this particular instance. Everything went black after that. That's just really weird. So there you have some of the papyri. And when you see at the bottom of your ESV, NASB, even NKJV has textual notes. It'll say some manuscripts say this. The NKJV actually doesn't say so much some manuscripts. It will say NU and TR. How many have a New King James? Anybody have a New King James? Got two. You two ought to be sitting next to eeach other, because do you know her? I'd just like to introduce you to. It's always good to have people, you know, who know each other ecclesiastically and biblically. The New King James is an excellent translation, but it's a translation of the same Greek text that the King James utilized. So it's a modern translation of a 500-year-old text, which is in and of itself rather interesting. Well, 450. It will have, when it says NU text, that means National United Bible Society. So it's talking about the modern text. And TR, Textus Receptus. So it'll have those little textual footnotes. Do you pretty much just ignore the textual footnotes, or do you find them to be rather interesting, or do you find them to be annoying?
I can't read them.
They're too small? Yeah, that is an issue. And you're rather young to have that issue. For those of us that are old, you know, that's pretty natural. It just looks like a smudge at the bottom of the page now. But then again, most of the pocket New Testaments I used to carry around look like just a bunch of smudges too. Most people, honestly, are bothered by those if they don't have a background to understand what it means, because it sounds like you're inculcating uncertainty, distrust in the text. You got to realize when the King James was originally published, it had hundreds, if not thousands, of those types of notes in the margins. The modern King Jameses don't normally include what was included by the King James translators themselves. They had alternate translations, they had textual notes, all sorts of neat stuff like that. Originally, most of you who have a King James have what's called a 1769 Blaney revision. You don't have the 1611 unless you're carrying around one of the very few facsimile editions that are available. They're next to impossible to read, given the font face that was used at the time. And the 1769 is, if you go buy a King James at the local bookstore, that's what it's going to be, is a 1769 Blaney revision. They will have these notes, and sometimes they're referring to the papyri, sometimes they're referring to the great uncials, the great majuscule texts. And so let's see if this will project without going black. Guess not. Well, okay, sort of. Still backwards, it's so weird. This is pretty much what I saw in the British Library, or was it British Museum? British Museum in London in 2005. Codex Sinaiticus is a long story, and it's a fascinating story. And some of you may have heard a debate I did with a guy down from, I think he's from Tennessee, one of the King James only conspiratorialist type guys that did a movie about how the Sinaiticus is a Jesuit plot and all the rest of this kind of stuff. Sinaiticus exists in a number of different places, given its history. So most of it is in London. Some of it's in Russia. I think there's a small fragment someplace else. It's all on one website anyways, codexsinaiticus.org. Though I've noticed, I can tell, you know how you can tell you're aging? I remember when codexsinaiticus.org went online and how cool it was. But since it hasn't been continuously updated, its coding isn't working as well with modern browsers now. And so it's becoming really frustrating. And it's like, come on, did you all run out of money? Or what, is there a place we can donate to try to get the things working right again? It's a little bit frustrating. But it is available online. and you're supposed to be able to zoom in on it and stuff like that, and some of the buttons just aren't working right anymore, and it's sad. You just can tell when you're aging. When you remember a website came online and now it's dying slowly. But this is what I pretty much saw when I walked right up to it. All it was under glass. I was stunned. There were no guards around. There was nobody around. I was the only one in the room. And this was sitting there, and then right next to it was Codex Alexandrinus, which is another major important treasure. And there was nobody around. I was just shocked at the ease of access that I had at that time. I can't imagine it would still be that easy. But you can't really tell from that. You can tell a little bit better from this. And unfortunately, again, it's fairly small. But it looks like it's printed. The regularity of the formation of the letters and the beauty of the handwriting is simply stunning. It really, really is. The theory is that after the peace of the church in 313, 12 years later, you have the Council of Nicaea in... Very good. Now those of you who are just now starting to attend, you're sort of wondering, did you already brainwash these people? What on earth is going on? What have I walked into here? But I've already announced, if you weren't here this morning or yesterday, that any class that I teach when I teach church history, the one thing you know, it's going to be on the final, is the date of the Council of Nicaea, which was 325 AD. And at that time, shortly after that, Eusebius tells us that Constantine, the emperor, gave money for the copying of Bibles. And people are like, see, Constantine was making up the Bible. No, he wasn't. The Bible already existed. Constantine knew that the Romans had been destroying the Bible for many decades, and so he gave money for the copying of Bibles. And a lot of people feel that Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are two of the professionally made Bibles that came about as a result of that. Some would put them, let's say, as 350, so maybe not. But they come from that time period, and they are simply beautiful. And they're not just the New Testament. They include the Old Testament in Greek as well. And so the Vatican manuscript had been in the Vatican Library for a long period of time. It's not quite as pretty for the simple reason that sometime in the 17 or 1800s, we don't know exactly when, some poor guy who I guess did something wrong and got in trouble with his superior or something, was assigned the task of taking that entire manuscript, and since it was fading, retracing every letter. Can you imagine doing that? Now, that makes it real easy to read, but that's now another step of editing, because what if he misread it? What if it was questionable? I mean, that actually lowers the value of the manuscript in essence, that you would have a modern corruption of it in that way. Sinaiticus was found at the Sinai Monastery, of course. That's why it's called what it's called. By Constantine von Tischendorf. There is a tremendous amount of... It would be an interesting movie, honestly. In fact, Dan Wallace does view himself as a modern-day Tischendorf. He really does. And many people feel... Who was modeled after Tischendorf in the movies? No one knows? Who? I heard it. Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones was modeled after Constantine von Tischendorf. Von Tischendorf was a Greek scholar. I mean, his scholarship was exemplary. And the nice thing is, he was a believer. He really was. He was not one of those German leftist rationalists. He was German, but he was a true believer, and he believed the Bible was the Word of God. And he just felt that somewhere out there was a really ancient codex and manuscript of the New Testament, and it just needed to be found. And we weren't digging deep enough. And so he made, when he first, I need to at least tell this part of the story because it is sort of fun. When he went to the Sinai Monastery the first time, and Dan Wallace has been to the monastery a couple times himself, you got into it by riding in this big bucket up the wall, because this is a fortress. And I can't imagine what that would be like, especially in the 1800s. He was a rather adventuresome fellow. He one day saw some monks carrying some leaves of manuscripts to be burned in the kitchen, because they had a huge library, and these books would shed pages. And if you don't clean up the floor, what's going to eventually happen? It's a fire hazard. And so, you know, once it's underneath a shelf someplace, you can't tell what book it came from, so they had to pick this stuff up and just use it as kindling in the kitchen. And he stopped the monk and he starts looking through this material, and he's like, this is ancient material. This is extremely valuable. So here they've got this weird German visitor who's all freaked out about their garbage. You know, they're used for kindling in the kitchen. And he's like, you can't burn this stuff. You've got to save this. This is really, really, really important. And they let him keep the leaves. But he sort of freaked him out by the way he sort of overreacted. And so they wouldn't show him anything else. It was years later that he visited again. And the last night that he was going to be there, he had published an edition of the Greek Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. And so as a gift, he wanted to give this to the monk that had been sort of assigned to sort of take him around and show him stuff and just basically keep him out of trouble, really. And so he hands the monk this thing, and the monk looks at it and says, oh, I have something like this. And so he takes him to his cell, and he goes into his closet, and he takes out this volume that is wrapped in red cloth. So whenever you hear about Sinaiticus being found in the trash can, it was wrapped in red cloth in the monk's closet. That's where you keep your special stuff, okay? And he unwraps this thing, and Tischendorf is staring at Sinaiticus. But Tischendorf is wiser than the earlier, younger Tischendorf was. And so he's playing it cool. It's sort of like, oh, yeah, that's nice, yeah. You mind if I, look through it, take a look at it for a little while, you know? Oh yeah, sure. So he, von Tischendorf goes back to his room, closes the door, and I cannot prove this because the MP4 file is corrupted from the video of this. Just seeing how many of you are still awake. But I'm pretty certain that this is what happened. Door closed. That's my impression, I think, of, like I said, the MP4 file is a little bit tough to follow. But he obviously didn't sleep that night. And he's just, because you got to realize this is moving. Well, it moved the Old Testament text back at that point to, that moved it back by about 600 years, and the New Testament text back by about 400 years from the earliest they had at that point in time. And he was just blown away. He's looking up all these texts and he's making notes, and of course the next morning he tries to buy it, he's turned down. It's a long story about how it eventually ended up in London via Russia. The monks of Sinaiticus to this day consider it their own and that it's been stolen from them. And they even have a note from Tischendorf saying that once he got the Tsar involved, basically. And there's question about whether, even with the Tsar's involvement, whether Tischendorf didn't promise to bring it back. Long story that there's debates about to this very day. But eventually, when the Russians were having real monetary problems, the British public raised the funds. It was the original GoFundMe. It was a startup thing, and they raised the money to be able to purchase Sinaiticus back, I think, in the 1930s, as I recall. And it has been there ever since. And when Westcott and Hort, two names that you should know in the 1870s and 80s, who really became the fathers of modern textual critical theory in many ways, when Westcott and Hort produced their own text in 1881, they relied very, very heavily on Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. And when Sinaiticus and Vaticanus agreed, I think almost every time that happened, that became the text that they produced in their Greek New Testament. Modern scholarship has rebalanced itself, shall we say, and corrected the overemphasis that Westcott and Hort had on Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. But at the time, they were the earliest manuscripts that we had. Here is an example from the website, and you can actually, the difference between the two is that you can actually set the website to either straight on light or a raking light that actually shows you the surface of the parchment, because these are animal skins. And I don't know how they did it. I know how we would do it today with lasers and machines and everything else. But they could make parchment leaves of animal skins back then that were like 1/500th of a centimeter. I mean, just incredibly high quality stuff. I don't know how they did it, but they did it. And so you can see not only the regularity of the letters, but this is a text that was in use for hundreds and hundreds of years, over 1,000 years. And so over time, various people made notes in it, including textual notes. So you can see up here at the top, you can see someone has written in a reading in between the lines. And there's dots right there saying this, indicating a textual variant at this particular point. And when you look at the manuscript, Hendrickson publishes a facsimile of Sinaiticus. It weighs 45 pounds. It is super high quality paper. You have one? You wish you had one? Yeah, go ahead, admit it. Yeah, it's okay, it's all right. It's okay to, we are all accepting here of geeks, because I already have one. In fact, on the dividing line, you can see it from the one camera angle over my shoulder. You can see Sinaiticus, and the book right on top of that is a 1689 New Testament commentary that Adnan Rashid gave me in a debate at Kensington Temple in London a few years ago. And then right on top of that is a 1550 Stephanus Greek text. And it is a 1550 Stephanus Greek text, the real genuine article. I had it locked up in a fireproof safe until mold started to show up, and no, we're not going to do that, so let's put it out where it's nice and dry. So that's where it is. But you can see what Sinaiticus looks like there. Here's Vaticanus, and it is now online as well. The Vatican website has now made it available. I zoom in on everything. But as I said, it was rewritten in essence, not rewritten as in recopied, but just every letter gone back over only a few hundred years ago, which was a bad thing to do. And there's Codex Alexandrinus. That's the other one that I saw sitting next to Sinaiticus. And that has a beautiful color to it. That's why I used it to make a tie once. Well, not the manuscript, but pictures of the manuscript. That is a beautiful gold tie that I use for witnessing to Muslims. If you want more information on that, you can find out from somebody else. Anyway, so here you have some of these major unsealed manuscripts. So when you read those footnotes, and they're saying certain early manuscripts say this, that, or that thing, probably one of these, or manuscripts like Codex Washingtonianus, which is one of the earliest examples of the Byzantine text type. Some of these major unsealed texts that are all listed. If I forgot to bring my Greek New Testament back up with me, but you will find either in the electronic versions or in the paper versions, all these things will be listed, where they're stored, what the best guess as to their dating is, what they contain. Why do I say this? One of the things that I like to point out to my Muslim friends is that we Christians are wide open about the history of the New Testament text. We don't hide anything. They can buy all the same software that we offer, that we can make available. We don't hide anything. It's a very different situation in the study of the Qur'an. I remember back when I first started studying Islam, around 2008, I'd say. this palimpsest manuscript. Now, a palimpsest, I need to explain that. Palimpsest manuscripts are fascinating because since these were animal skins, you could reuse them. And you could wash the ink off and put something else on it. And so a palimpsest is a manuscript where you had one thing written initially, it's been wiped off and something else has been written on top of it. And what you do is you use various lighting sources, whether it's infrared, ultraviolet, depending on the kind of ink that was used and stuff like that, the kind of material. And you use, because you're using a quill, and so what's the quill going to do on an animal skin? It's going to scar it. It's going to make an indentation on it. And with the proper equipment, you can read what's called the undertext. Sounds like something from the Marvel universe or something like that. It's the undertext, and whatever. And so a palimpsest is a manuscript that has two different texts on it. And there was a palimpsest manuscript of the Qur'an that came up for auction at Sotheby's in London. And we were all really fascinated to find out what this thing might contain, what readings it might have, and stuff like that. It was purchased by an anonymous purchaser, and we've never seen it again. We may never see it again. Because I could fully see how a super rich oil sheik would buy that thing, realize that it would be problematic to the Orthodox understanding of the history of the Qur'an, and light that baby up, and we'd never see it again. There is no critical edition of the Qur'an. There's no comparison to my Nestle 28th edition or to the ECM that's coming out right now. Will there be someday? If there is, it won't have been produced by Muslims. It'll have been produced by, or at least by practicing Muslims. It will, maybe secular Muslims possibly, but Orientalists outside of the Islamic faith will probably be the ones that end up producing something like that. That is one of the major differences between us. So with that in mind, which direction do I want to go here? Because we're looking at, okay, so now you've got some of your background that you need. What then are we dealing with when we come to the issue of the King James only controversy and where we are today? At least we have a foundation upon which to start considering some of these things. Let me start by asking, how many of you, like me, grew up on the King James? Okay, all right. That was probably a generational divide right there. Almost, not exclusively, but that was pretty much a generational divide. How many of you that are less than 30 grew up on the King James? See, that cut it down big time. Let's see who has had as their primary translation for most of their life. Who has had the NIV? All right, New American Standard. Okay, there you can find the Orthodox folks. ESV? Now, see, that's fascinating because the ESV is the youngest of all of those. And yet, once again, like I said, it is the Borg of modern English translations. It's just assimilated everybody else. The promotion of it was just done phenomenally well. I guess I should ask New King James. I suppose that's possible. Is there any New King James folks? Okay, all right. The fundamental difference that divides these translations is the Greek text from which it is translated. There are only the, I'm going to go ahead and I keep making reference to it, so I might as well grab it. Besides that, I promised Jeffrey that I would show it, a certain number of times during each seminar so that he would keep getting more business. So actually I didn't, but he doesn't mind when I do that. The primary issue in the King James only controversy is not translational philosophy. Translational philosophy is very important. Translational philosophy is normally focused upon the difference between what is called formal equivalency and what's called dynamic or functional equivalency. Anybody, how many of you in here would consider yourself truly, minimally bilingual or more? You know at least 2 languages, maybe more. Anyone? And would that be Spanish maybe? Spanish? Is that Spanish? Dutch. There are very few that can handle that one. Notice that means the vast majority of us are functionally monolingual. I have studied German, and since my German's a whole lot better than my French, I can't remember any of the French I studied for a few years, but mainly because, this is real simple. You don't pronounce half the French language anyways. So why should you bother remembering it? That's my philosophy. If a language is going to put a letter there, I want it to have a meaning, and I want it to be pronounced. And so every German word, every letter gets pronounced. Even when you're just cramming 4 or 5 German words together into one big, huge German word, they all get pronounced, and it is a whole lot of fun. So, but I did study French for a few years, but it just all went bye-bye. So German, French, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin. The only language I try to speak other than English is German, and that's because I get to go over to Germany as often as I do and inflict myself upon my German friends who find it so quaint that he's trying anyways. But this is a major reason why the King James only controversy exists, is those who already know how to translate from one language to another recognize the difficulties and the categories that you have to utilize to translate properly. And that very often there is more than one way to render from one language into another language. And sometimes the reality is that there are phrases and colloquialisms, idioms in one language that just simply do not, if you translate it literally, will not make a lick of sense in the target language. You just can't do it. I mean, if you do it literally, it will not make any sense at all. It is not possible. And that is true for Greek, Hebrew, coming into English. You encounter colloquialisms and idioms that just don't necessarily make sense in English. And hence there is a level of interpretation in all translation. That is the reality of language. That's why Google can only do so much, and once in a while Google comes up with some really funny translations as a result. That's just how our minds work. That's how languages develop. Languages develop over time, and sometimes they develop some really weird stuff. And probably one of the weirdest languages is English. It is amazing that it has become such an international language, given the fact that it is so transparently made up, cobbled together from all sorts of German and French and Latin and Greek and all sorts of things, just all mangled together in a mess of contradiction and inconsistency. I mean, that's the English language. Let's just be honest with ourselves. And so when you do translation from one language to another, for example, I've been teaching for EBTC, the European Biblical Training Centers. They have a school in Berlin and European Ukraine, which is a suburb of Kiev, and Zurich, and they've got one in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Italy, all over the place. I really enjoy teaching for them, but that means I get translated a lot. I do a lot of teaching with translation. And when I listen to me being translated into Russian, for some reason nothing sticks. Bolga, I know God, that's it. Everything else just. So I'm not even distracted by that, because nothing that the other person's saying, my translator almost always is a fellow named Nick, Nick can go on forever. I'm not going to care because nothing he's saying is making any sense to me at all. But when I'm being translated into German, as I was just a few weeks ago by Brother Tobias in Frankfurt while I was speaking on this subject, interestingly enough, it's very hard for me. Because I know what he's saying. I can understand what he's saying. And what's happening is I'm hearing his rephrasing of what I just said in English. And I can't turn my mind off from hearing it. And so it's very distracting because I'm trying to form the next part of my thought, but I can understand German well enough. I know what he's saying, and it's almost like an echo, but it's an echo that's been changed. And like, for example, once my translator, a different translator at EBTC, I said something about my Fliegel, my bow tie. And he translated it Kravat. Now, Kravat is just a normal term for a tie. And I had to stop, and I said, ich habe nicht gesagt Kravat, ich habe Fliegel gesagt. And it's really funny when someone's translating you, and you turn to them and speak to them in the language that they're translating into, you know what the automatic thing is? They start translating back the other direction. So he started saying what I said in English. And it's like, oh, wait, you don't have to do that. Never mind. Okay, stop. You know, it's fascinating. I've had that happen a number of times when I've stopped and said, that's not what I said. And you don't want to do that to your translator too often. You must be nice to your translator. Translators are wonderful people who work very, 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 very hard. And that's why you try to avoid using colloquialisms and idioms and we preachers are horrible to our translators when we try to use poetry or hymn lines or stuff like that, because it just doesn't translate across in almost any other target language. There are just things like that that you become accustomed to, you understand when you understand other languages. So the idea of a 17th century English translation of the Bible being a re-inspiration of the Bible that functionally ends up taking precedence over the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts, which is what you have in the most extreme forms of King James onlyism, is an astonishing idea. It really is. It would require, in essence, a re-inspiration of the Bible. And that's why I say this debate doesn't take place in academia, because I don't know of any serious academics that really believe that the King James translators were somehow re-inspiring the Bible. But it does exist in many churches. It has split many churches. I mentioned last night the first time I ever heard of this movement was from my parents. They had just come back from down south. I think they were in Tennessee. And they were talking about how all these churches were splitting over this King James only movement. It is a relatively new movement. Its origins only go back to the 1950s. And so it has a very checkered past. I mentioned to you last evening one of the names that became famous in the late 1980s, early 1990s was Gail Ripplinger. She's still around. Not overly active, except in a very, very, very narrow spectrum. But her book, New Age Bible Versions. But the most famous King James only advocate by far passed away last year at, I don't know, what was he? He was ancient. Dr. Peter S. Ruckman. Peter S. Ruckman was the head of the Pensacola Bible, was it Pensacola Bible School? Which is different than Pensacola Institute. There's two different schools there. I don't want to get you all confused about which one's which, but so much so that you would identify people as Ruckmanites. And there have been others. D.A. Waite is fairly well known. There's a debate between he and I from a radio station once that you can listen to. for some reason, as soon as I heard about King James Onlyism, I started studying it because I was once I got into Bible college, I was taking Greek. I just found it fascinating. I had no idea, never intended to write a book on it, never intended to become the primary person that they hate, and now create memes of and all sorts of videos of me and flames with horns and just, that's not exactly what you want to do with your life when you're in Bible college. That'd be cool someday to be, hated by everybody like that. But I did find it fascinating, and especially since I was already getting into apologetics, I realized it was a relevant issue that needed to be addressed. And I had some correspondence with Ruckman. You can read my correspondence on my website if you just put Ruckman into the search engine at aomin.org. Be prepared to sit there and go, you've got to be kidding me. Because this was long before Twitter, and it was worse than Twitter, if you can believe that. With Twitter, Facebook, whatever you want. This was actually when you would type a letter and print it on a printer, normally a dot matrix printer, and you'd sign it and you put it in an envelope and you'd put these things called stamps. Some of you young folks have not seen these before. They were really cool things, little square. And in fact, this is so long ago that you licked the stamp. You actually used your tongue, or sometimes you could use other things if you didn't want to do that. But some of us gluttons for punishment would use our tongue to lick this thing, put it on, and it stuck. It was really cool. It's an adhesive thing. It's really neat. You'll have to see it sometime. I'm sure they've got some in the local museums if you want to go see how that worked. Then you would deliver it to this funny-looking man in a uniform, and he would take it away from you. And somehow, magically, days later, it would arrive at the person that you wanted it to go to. Days later. Sometimes getting lost in the process, too. You never know. And this is how we did things back then. Well, my correspondence with Peter Ruckman, he would send my letters back to me with the most incredible things written in the margins. How many of you have seen my correspondence with Ruckman? Anybody who's seen it? Nobody has. You have? Okay. Just insulting things. I mean, some of you, how many of you have heard of Miguel Servetus? Okay, what's he most famous for? Getting burned in Geneva. It wasn't Calvin that burned him either. Come on, get that right. That was the city council. But anyway, he was burned in Geneva during the days of Calvin. And what you may not know is that Calvin had known where he was and who he was long before he had been arrested. And Calvin had sent him the Institutes of the Christian Religion, and Servetus had sent them back to Calvin, his book back to Calvin, with all sorts of insulting stuff written in the margins, scribbled in the margins. You're wrong about this, you're an idiot, this type of stuff written in the margins of his book. So Ruckman had some historical precedent for sending my letters back to me with Sharpie type, big, bold stuff written in the margins. Ruckman was just he was a genius, but he was on the wrong side of the line of genius, because genius and insane are right next to each other. He hopped over the line to insanity more than once, and he even sent me a book at that time called Black is Beautiful. He was a racist. And I mean, he was an artist too. I don't know if any of you ever saw, you've seen on TV. He would do charcoal, beautiful charcoal drawings. He was clearly a very talented individual, but he did the drawings in this of black people as apes in the whole 9 yards. I mean, that's what he was like. And what did he write in the front of that one? Here's some more ammunition for you, Jimmy boy, is how he signed that book when he sent it to him. I mean, this was Ruckman. Anybody in a Ruckmanite church, therefore, is going to be exceptionally aggressive. And over the years, I've tried to differentiate between the various kinds of King James Onlyism. The Ruckmanite kind is cultic. It's simply cultic. It is unquestionable, authoritarian, abusive, It utilizes the same categories of twisting of history and everything else that you'll find amongst Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or anybody else. It's more abusive than most of the forms of those, actually. And so you will encounter that kind of King James onlyism out there. The Ripplingerite style is in the same category as that. Then if you move closer to sanity and truthfulness, you'll have the folks like D.A. Waite and the guy with the, I can see the books in my mind, which Bible Society? Fuller, David Otis Fuller. I'm just happy to remember any of these names at my age now. That any of them pop in, right, Alan? That any of them pop into your mind is like, yes, that brain cell hasn't died yet. Yeah, that's good. That's very good. I've been trying to keep it alive for a long time. And David Otis Fuller, D.A. Waite, they are not near, they don't have the kind of abusive personality. They can get aggressive, but they're not going to be aggressive in the sense of name calling and just the type of nastiness that marks the real cultic element. And they want to be somewhat restrained. They don't Ruckman was pretty straightforward in saying Greek and Hebrew doesn't matter. The King James corrects the Greek and the Hebrew. It basically was re-inspired in between 1604 and 1611. And Waite and Fuller and others didn't want to go that far. And I could really accept the idea that D.A. Waite, who may still be alive, I'm not sure, I did not hear that he had passed away. I could be wrong about that. He was fairly elderly when he and I, when did we do that radio debates? Sometime in the 90s, I think. So he was fairly elderly then, so he may not still be around, I'm not sure. I can come to the conclusion that these guys really, really believe what they're saying. And they really believe they are defending the Bible as the Word of God. And they really do believe that people like me are just absolutely enemies of God's truth. And then at some point, here's the divide. You want the dividing line? That's a nice term, dividing line. You want the dividing line of where to cut the King James camp into two different halves. Ask a person if there is any possibility that the King James could be improved upon as an English translation. So, for example, in 2 Peter 1:1 or in Titus 2:13, where you have a Granville-Sharp construction. Granville-Sharp, remember I mentioned Granville-Sharp, our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, Titus 2:13, our God and Savior, Jesus Christ, 2 Peter 1:1. Granville-Sharp did his work at the late 1790s into the early 19th century. So, in other words, the rule of grammar that is relevant to those two texts had not been formulated when the King James was translated. So you can't blame the King James translators for how they rendered those particular texts. And so a rational person, I would think, would go, well, yeah, okay, if the rule wasn't known back then it makes sense that you could improve the King James Version by, now that we understand this rule, rendering those texts in a proper way. So yes, there would be room for a revision of the King James in light of the advancement in an understanding of Greek grammar, things like that. Once a person would accept that, then I wouldn't put them into a King James only camp, but into a King James preferred type of a camp. And the King James onlyists will talk about the Textus Receptus. They will talk about the Greek manuscripts, but it really doesn't matter. When you show them things from those manuscripts, it doesn't matter. That's just to have more things to argue about. Once you get out of that camp, now the Greek text itself becomes the focus of your conversation. And you'll have, again, the two areas. One is the area of the theory of translation that you're going to use. And so the King James is almost always, not always, but almost always a formal equivalency literal translation. There are some places where it just abandons that and gets almost NIV-ish and then goes right back. But it's normally a formal equivalency translation over against, well, every translation is a mixture of the two, because you cannot literally translate Hebrew and Greek into English without some level of interpretation and some level of you just can't do it literally. It won't make any sense. So you've got that issue. But with these folks, now the text becomes the issue. And they really, really, really believe that the texts that underlie the King James are the best texts. And they'll have different reasons for that. One of them I mentioned to you last night that is most relevant to those of us who are Reformed is the fact that there are those who believe that there is an intimate connection between the Textus Receptus and the Westminster Confession of Faith and the London Baptist Confession of 1689 and the Savoy Declaration and the Puritans and so on and so forth, that this is the confessional Greek text. And they would argue that the eclectic text, that's the All-in United Bible Society, that the eclectic text has come into existence at a non-confessional time. And so there are those who promote something called the ecclesiastical text, that the church should determine the text of the New Testament. Well, that sounds wonderful. The problem is it has happened more than once in the past, and nobody believes what the church said in the past. What do I mean by that? Well, some of you may know that the Greek Septuagint was the church, that was the Bible of the early church. And it still is in Eastern Orthodoxy. But in the West, most people have never even heard of the Greek Septuagint. And in the West, the Latin West, what became the standard? The Latin Vulgate. The Latin Vulgate. When Erasmus came along, and we do need to, I suppose it would be a good time to let Erasmus speak, because Erasmus has a lot to do with this. Desiderius Erasmus is a name that may be difficult for you to remember at 3:05 on a Saturday afternoon as you're getting ready to take a Baptist nap right there in the middle of the pew. Yeah, well, me too in the pew. But if you've not heard his name before, Erasmus was a Dutch humanist. Now immediately, ooh, humanist, bad. In the 16th century, a humanist was not what a humanist is today. Today, a humanist is a secularist and an anti-theist and all the rest of that kind of stuff. Humanism in the Renaissance, prior to the Reformation, was an emphasis upon the use of original sources. Their famous line was ad fontes, to the source. And so Erasmus was maybe one of the last what we would call Renaissance men, where there were actually men in the past who would basically have knowledge in all fields of human knowledge, because human knowledge wasn't wide enough yet to preclude that of someone who was basically of a genius level. And Erasmus was a brilliant man. There's no question about it. But Erasmus had a particular interest in the original languages of the scriptures, because ad fontes, to the source. And so he learned Greek, and he recognized the real need for a published edition of the Greek New Testament, because up until the early part of the 1500s, the beginning of the 16th century, if you wanted to access the Greek text, you found a manuscript someplace. You went to the local cathedral library and you pulled out a handwritten Greek manuscript, and that's how you accessed it. Well, the problem was there are differences between them. And so he got the idea, we need to have a printed edition of the Greek New Testament, so that he had gotten all involved in the study of Paul, and he was sort of a proto-reformer. He never left the Roman Catholic Communion. He was a Roman Catholic priest, which is fascinating because King James onlyists love to accuse us, everybody on the other side, of being Jesuits and all the rest of that stuff, when the reality is the Greek text that was utilized went back to Erasmus, who himself was a Roman Catholic priest. They're just not consistent in their conspiracy theories. Most people are never consistent in their conspiracy theories. Anyway, he set to work knowing that a fellow by the name of Cardinal Jimenez had already produced a, was it 5 or 6 volume? I forget how many it was. A multi-volume set, polyglot, of the Latin and the Greek New Testament. You say, well, why would he even bother then? Because in that day, if you wanted to publish something in Europe, you had to get papal approval. And that was a long process. You think it's bad enough, you think the DMV is bad today? You had to, send letters, and they had to go through the postal system, and they had to be carried by Pony Express and everything else. It was a long process. And he didn't want to do a multi-volume thing. He wanted to do a single, small volume thing that could be carried around and actually utilized in a meaningful fashion. And so he moved to Basel, Switzerland, where he thought he would be able to find lots of manuscripts at the university library. He was disappointed. He only had about 6 or 7 manuscripts to work with for the entirety of the New Testament. And what's interesting is he relied upon a 14th century manuscript primarily. He didn't trust the best manuscript he had, which was from the 12th century. But you can say, well, how would he know? That's just it. Erasmus is living at a time where there is no such thing as textual criticism. We're just emerging out of the period of anachronism. Do you know what that means? During the medieval period in Europe, most people believed that everything had always been as it was now. So have you ever wondered why you see those paintings of David from the medieval period? And what's David doing? David's riding a horse in armor, living in a castle, because that's what nobility and kings do. And so David must have done the same thing. You got to realize, during the medieval period, most people in Europe never traveled more than 7 miles from the place of their birth in any one direction. Figure out how small your world was. That's a small circle. And so that's all you've ever seen. So you've never gone to Rome and seen the ruins of the Colosseum. You don't know about that. There's no Google, And so Rome, for example, got away for centuries with using fraudulent documents to substantiate papal authority. Some call the donation of Constantine, the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, all this type of stuff. They got away with it for centuries. Why? Because the only way to detect them was by the presence of anachronism. But no one understood what anachronism was yet. And what's an anachronism? An anachronism is something appearing to be at a certain time in history when you know it didn't exist at that time in history. But if everything's always been the same, you can't detect anachronism. It is an anachronism to have David in a suit of armor living in a castle, unless you don't know that anachronism exists and that you assume everything's always been the same. And so there was a man who lived just before Erasmus by the name of Lorenzo Valla. And Lorenzo Valla was one of the first people in the West to break out of this mindset and not only realize that things had changed, but that they had changed a lot, and that you could detect these changes. And so Lorenzo Valla had examined the donation of Constantine and realized it was a fraud. It was a fake. Well, papal authority was based on it. So what would happen if you published a paper saying that one of the primary foundations of papal authority was a fraud in that day? you'd get tied to a stake and burned to a crisp. You wouldn't just simply be bad Lorenzo Valla. No, you'd be fried Lorenzo Valla. And so he never published his findings. Erasmus ran across them in a library after Valla was dead. So I suppose they could have dug up his bones and burned him, I suppose. They did that to Wycliffe, so it was a possibility. But Erasmus published Valla's works. And so Erasmus is now living in the day where they're starting to recognize, that ad fontes, go to the sources, analyze these things, all these fake documents are being recognized, et cetera, et cetera. And so he sort of has to make up textual criticism as he's going along. He doesn't have any guide. There isn't, there's all sorts of books you can go to now and read all about how to do textual criticism. And they may disagree with one another, but there's general principles. He has to figure it out as he's going along. And he's got about 6 or 7 manuscripts, and they don't agree with each other 100% of the time. And so he's got to sort of come up with rules in his own mind as to what I'm going to put here. And he's not consistent, but he does a fairly decent job. He is rushing a bit because his printer, John Froben, also knows that Cardinal Jimenez has already printed his texts. They're sitting in they're beautiful texts, sitting in boxes in a storage room someplace, just waiting for Rome to say, okay, you can go ahead and distribute these. And Froben's figuring, knowing my luck, that's going to happen the day before we go to press with our own. So Froben's putting Erasmus under pressure, and so he's doing the best he can, and he's not perfectly consistent, even using his own manuscripts. He's only using a manuscript that's a little over 100 years old as his primary manuscript. He doesn't have anything like what we've seen up here. He doesn't have Sinaiticus. He knows of Vaticanus. He knows that Vaticanus exists. No one at that time knew how old it was. Paleography had not yet developed. But there was the famous Vatican manuscript that was famous for, at least it looks really old. And at one point he asked a friend of his in Rome about the famous passage of 1 John 5:7. He asked him to go check that manuscript. And his friend did. His friend's name was Bombasius, and confirmed that the Vatican manuscript did not contain 1 John 5:7. So anyway, what happens is that Erasmus gets to the last book of the New Testament, and none of his manuscripts contain it. None of his manuscripts contain it. And he looks all over Basel, Switzerland. He cannot find a Greek manuscript of the book of Revelation anywhere. And Froben's like, come on, we gotta get this done. And so what he does is he finds a Latin commentary on the book of Revelation that has the Greek text interspersed that's being commented on. And so he extracts the Greek text from the Latin commentary to create the book of Revelation. But here's the problem. The last few pages of the book were missing. So he doesn't have the last few verses of Revelation chapter 22. So he's gone this far. He's already got major problems in Revelation. It's not well done. In comparison to everything else he's done, it's pretty poor. And now he comes to the last few verses, and he was only been able to find this. He's gonna, it's not like you can jump in a car and drive to the next city or something like that. You're talking days minimally to get someplace else, and then days to come back, and then to do the work, and et cetera, et cetera. He just can't do it. So what he does is he back translates. He takes the Latin Vulgate, and he translates from Latin into Greek for like the last 6 verses of the book of Revelation. And in the process comes up with readings that no one has ever seen in a Greek manuscript anywhere, which are still in the Textus Receptus to this day, and in the King James Version of the Bible, by the way, which is fascinating. So he finishes it up, And in 1516, the first edition, which Erasmus said was precipitated rather than edited, is published by John Froben. You would say, no, wait a minute. Didn't they have to stick it in a warehouse someplace to wait for papal approval? Yeah, well, Erasmus took a chance. And he went ahead and made it available for sale. And the way he tried to cover his tracks was he dedicated the volume to Pope Leo X. So he dedicates it to the same Pope who writes Exsurge Domine. What is Exsurge Domine? Arise, O Lord, a boar has broken out in your vineyard. That was the excommunication of Martin Luther. So the same Pope that excommunicates Martin Luther is the Pope to which the original, what becomes the Textus Receptus, was dedicated to. You will not learn that from your local King James only advocate, I assure you of that. That is not something that they include in the information. Now, what's important to recognize is now that it was out and Froben's investment was safe because it sold quite well, now Erasmus could turn himself to improving it. Because when Erasmus first put it together, his focus was not on the Greek. That was a side thing. His focus was on his own new Latin translation. That was the dangerous thing, because he was providing a Latin translation other than the official Latin Vulgate of the Church. And so it was an extremely controversial publication. And he was attacked vociferously. But it does seem to me that Erasmus would have truly enjoyed the internet. I really, really think he would have never would have gotten to the next 4 editions of his Greek New Testament, because he would have spent all his time on Twitter doing just, you know those people. Yeah, I know them too. He, I think, really would have enjoyed it. And so he turns his attention to the second edition, and he starts writing annotations, notes, because of all the attacks he's getting. And at first the attacks are primarily on his Latin translation, because he's dared to question the supremacy of the Vulgate. But then it starts switching to the Greek as people start realizing that now this Greek is out there, and hey, the Greek's the language of the heretics. They knew that Greek was the original language of the New Testament, but now Latin, God had blessed Latin for 1,100 years, so clearly God had changed what he wanted. You chuckle at that, but that's pretty much what the King James only guys are saying too. They've just gone to English. And so people noticed that at 1 John 5:7, that Erasmus had not included in his Greek version the longer version that is found in the Latin Vulgate. There are 3 that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these 3 are one. He did not include that in his first edition of the Greek New Testament. It is not found in the second edition that came out about 2 years later. And so he is attacked for this. And so he just honestly says, I've never seen a Greek manuscript that contains these words. And so around 1520, a Greek manuscript is presented to Erasmus that contains the words of what's called the Comma Johanneum at 1 John 5:7. The problem is it was a brand new manuscript that had been written that year, specifically to refute him. It is Codex Montfortianus. It is in Trinity College in Dublin, and I have held it in my hot little hands and turned it to 1 John 5:7 and examined that. It opens on its own to that, because that's its only value, really. We know exactly when it was written and who had it written and the whole 9 yards. It's available online now. It wasn't when I first saw it, but about 6 months later it became available. Anyway, and so true to his word, in the 3rd edition, Erasmus inserted the Comma Johanneum and put a long note in his annotations as to why he felt he had been deceived and why it's not original and so on and so forth. But that's why you have 1 John 5:7 in the King James Version of the Bible, is because of that. It has been in the Latin Vulgate for a very, very long time. How many of you have seen the Jack Chick anti-Catholic comic books? You know, the anti-Catholic comic book from Jack Chick? He did a lot of that at the behest of a guy named Alberto Rivera, who claimed to be a former Roman Catholic priest. And I met Alberto Rivera many years ago. No one on the planet had any idea who in the world I was. But I met him when he was speaking in Phoenix. And I remember very, very clearly that he had, Benny went with me, that he had, only Alan would know that, so I was just passing that little bit of information along there, don't worry about it. We attended his talk. Weirdly enough, it was at a non-Trinitarian church, which was strange. And then afterwards, he was about yay big, I would say. And we started talking, and he saw my Bible, and he said, "What kind of Bible is that?" And well, it was a New American Standard. And he said, "You do realize that by using that Bible, you will go to hell." He didn't care about what my understanding of the gospel was, or the fact I was carrying a New American Standard Bible meant I was going to hell. That's just all there was to it. And so there are people that you will meet today that make 1 John 5:7 the defining reality of whether you're going to heaven or hell. If you have 1 John 5:7 in your Bible, you might make it, but if you don't got a chance. You don't got a chance. And you're looking at me like, are you serious? I am absolutely serious. I have met these people. He may be one of the more famous of them, but there are a lot of people that will make that the litmus test as to whether your Bible is a true Bible, whether it has the Comma Johanneum in it. Now, it's an ancient reading, but it's not an ancient reading in the Greek manuscripts. It arises in the Latin Vulgate. It arises in the Latin text. It was probably an explanatory note in a Latin manuscript that became incorporated into the Latin Vulgate and became the standard reading of the Latin Vulgate over time. But hear me out here. If the Comma Johanneum was original to the epistle of 1 John, then we don't have much confidence that we possess all the original readings of the New Testament. Because the fact of the matter is, it is nowhere to be found in the Greek manuscript tradition of 1 John until the 14th century. So if you can go for 1,400 years with a highly significant Trinitarian passage completely excised, taken out, wiped out of the Greek manuscript tradition, when it was originally there, what else could be lost? The King James Only Advocate doesn't think of these things. That's not relevant to them. It doesn't matter to them. It really, really doesn't. The issue is, for the King James Only Advocate, just for the real believing King James Only Advocate, the Word of God equals the King James Bible. That equals sign is unquestionable, and if you do anything to it, if you modify it, they believe you are attacking the Word of God. And so they look at someone like myself as an absolute enemy of everything that's good and right and righteous and everything else. I mean, satanically inspired, whatever. I get it pretty much every day. If I wanted to find it, all I got to do is go on YouTube and just read the comment sections, and I can find pretty much every possible insult you could find, even to this day, on this particular subject. And 1 John 5:7, in their mind, is the clearest indication of that issue. And yet, in reality, the position they're taking makes the defensibility of the Greek New Testament impossible on a scholarly level. because what they're saying is an entire reading can simply disappear without any evidence and has to be restored from foreign language translations. That's a huge, huge thing to be saying. And that's what they are saying. They don't care that they're saying it, and they don't realize that undercuts their own position. The hallmark of King James onlyism is absolute incoherence, inconsistency. They never apply the same standards to their own position they apply to others. Never. Can't be done. As soon as you do it, the position becomes circular and falls apart. So they don't go there. Erasmus, as I mentioned, did not stop. Erasmus continued work, and he eventually did 5 editions of his Greek New Testament. 5 editions. Last one was in 1535, shortly before his death. Sold really well. Most of you know the Reformation connection here, because that first edition that sold really well found its way into the hands of a certain Augustinian monk who was teaching at the University of Wittenberg in Germany by the name of Martin Luther. And it was through the study of Martin Luther's, it was through the use of Erasmus's Greek text in Martin Luther's study, especially of penance, that he came to recognize the difference between poenitentiam agate, do penance, and then right across the page, metanoiete, repent, change of heart, change of mind, change of direction. They're not the same thing. And having them right across the page like that was exceptionally important in Luther coming to understand those aspects of divine truth. And so when you keep that in mind, that work of Erasmus was very, very important. Those 5 editions are the beginning of what is now called the Textus Receptus. They were not identical with one another. He made changes in all of them. There are small differences between each one. Then the next major guy, I thought about bringing it, but just too many plane trips, is Calvin's printer. His name is Robert Estienne, but he's better known as Stephanus. And Stephanus produced a beautiful folio edition of the Greek New Testament in 1550. And that's what I have in my office, is a 1550 Stephanus. It is still, I mean, it has gilded edges to this day. I have textbooks from seminary in the late 1980s that have had their pages yellow more than my 1550 Stephanus. You know why? They made paper well back then. We make paper cheaply. We don't make books to last. They did, which is testimony to why mine's still there. I literally, the whiteness of the paper in my 1550 is better than some of my textbooks from seminary. The font, the beautiful Greek font in my 1550 Stephanus was designed by Robert Estienne's friend Garamond. Ever seen the Garamond font in your computer? Garamond? That's where the name came from. And Garamond designed this beautiful Greek font that is used in it. There are textual notes in it. But what's interesting is the 1550 is the last edition of the Greek New Testament that does not have verse divisions. There's a 1551, and in 1551, Robert Estienne, Stephanus, introduced the verse divisions to the New Testament. Didn't have them before then. So all that numerological stuff where people are adding up verses and all the rest of that stuff, it is pure bunk. There were no verse numbers in the originals. The chapter divisions had been introduced during the medieval period. And it was 1551 where verse divisions showed up. And sometimes hey, that's not easy to do. It is not easy to come up with logical divisions in stuff that's been written. And so sometimes we pick on poor Robert Estienne as to where he put the verse divisions, going, that's not where it should have been at all. I mean, come on. And sometimes the chapter divisions, going back farther, we think, that's not good. But it revolutionized things, for good and for bad. I mean, it was pretty tough to find references up until you had verses. Yeah, I mean, how exactly did you remember that place in Hebrews? Well, yeah, okay. Let's go looking for that. 3 hours later, found it. Okay, everybody else is falling asleep, so you sort of give up. 1551, Stephanus introduces the verse divisions. And they then become translated into translations as they're made from these. So you have the versions of Stephanus, Erasmus, and finally, you have Theodore Beza. Who was Theodore Beza? Beza was Calvin's successor at Geneva. Theodore Beza was the head of the great school there in Geneva, and he had a special interest in biblical manuscripts. And in fact, there is a particular biblical manuscript that was donated to him called Codex Catabrigiensis. Beze Catabrigiensis. It's Codex D. It's the living Bible of the early church. It is the most unreliable, weird manuscript we have from the New Testament, of the New Testament. It has many, many singular readings where the editor, for example, when Peter is freed by the angel from prison, we are told exactly how many steps he went down to the street. Who knew? It's a weird one. And when it was donated to Beze, he recognized how idiosyncratic it was. And so when he donated it to Cambridge University, he donated it with a note that says, this manuscript is better to be stored than to be read. I sort of wish it had remained that way because it's a pain, to be perfectly honest with you. Beza came out with an edition of the Greek New Testament in 1598. And it was extremely popular, and it was especially popular because what's 1598? That's only 6 years prior to what? Well, remember, the King James didn't just get translated in 1 year. The King James was translated between 1604 and 1611. And the primary Greek text that the King James translators relied upon seems to have been Beza's 1598, but they very clearly also used Stephanus, and they used the editions of Erasmus as well. What you need to understand is the King James translators never used manuscripts. They only used printed editions of the Greek New Testament. They did not go to manuscripts. They did not ask for the Vatican manuscript. They did not examine minuscule texts or uncials, or there weren't any papyri available to them, even if they had known what they were. They did not have access to those things. The King James translators basically did not do much in the way of textual criticism. They relied upon the already done work by Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza. And when they disagreed with one another, they had to make a choice. But the King James was translated by different committees. So the Gospels were done by one committee, and Paul was done by another committee. And the problem is the committees didn't always do it the same way. So there's no consistency as to which text was followed, why. That's why there's also translational inconsistencies. For example, I hate to pick on him, but Alan Willis is here, and he remembers when he had hair. When we first started Alpha and Omega Ministries many moons ago. I don't know if you remember when I wrote a bunch of articles against Dennis McKinsey of Biblical Errancy, an atheist. He was one of the first people I took on when I was, still in my 20s at that point in time. And he would just create all sorts of alleged contradictions in the Bible, and most of them were just simply silly if you knew anything about the background of the Bible. But one that caught a lot of people was that in Matthew, in the King James Version of the Bible, it said, "You shall not kill." And in Romans, I think it's chapter 13, the King James said, you shall not murder. Well, which one is it? Murdering is not killing. They're not exactly identical to one another. He said, see, the Bible doesn't know which one it is. Well, the problem is, you look at the Greek, even in the Textus Receptus, and both of them are ou phanusis. It's the exact same Greek. But one committee translated the Gospels, it's in Matthew, one committee translated Paul, and there was not then a controlling committee that then evened all that stuff out and made it consistent all the way across the King James. And so you have inconsistencies. Another one that's really, that a cult has taken advantage of. In John 3, when Jesus talks about being born from above, and he talks heavenly and earthly and things like that. Those Greek words are also found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, but there the King James translators used celestial and terrestrial for the very same Greek words. That's where Joseph Smith came up with the 3 levels of heaven, celestial and terrestrial, and then made up the level telestial by taking the first 2 words, the letters of terrestrial, and slapping them on the last part of celestial. And that's where he came up with it, not knowing it just simply means heavenly and earthly, and that's exactly how it's rendered in John chapter 3, but that was a different translation committee for the King James. So there's no consistency. They used different texts. The 1550 Stephanus I've got, it could have been used by the King James translators. I don't know. They did use it. We do know they used it. That very one could have been. I don't know. How did it get over here? Who knows? But this was the process that went along. And it's also important to remember that the King James translators were primarily scholars. They wrote and spoke and thought in Latin. And so they utilized the Latin Vulgate, and there are certain places in the King James where the grammar more closely follows a Latinized version than Greek. They were, in essence, more familiar with Latin than they were with Greek. And so there are issues. They were great scholars. It was a great translation. It was not the first English translation. The Puritans did not like the King James Bible at all. They much preferred the Geneva. There was a bishop's Bible before that. You had Tyndale's work, etc., etc. But it did become the standardized English translation for a great period of time. But here's the point. They did not have a single unified Greek text from which they drew. So how do modern King James only advocates deal with that? I mean, they have a Bible that draws from a number of different printed Greek texts, but it also draws from the Latin Vulgate, which was the official translation of the Roman Catholic Church. How do they deal with that? Well, talking about the history of the text is not one of the primary things that King James only advocates do. That's not their thing. The King James onlyism allows you to create a unified us versus them mentality. And in that kind of fundamentalism, as long as you can get that us versus them mentality going, everything you want to do is oriented toward keeping that. And you don't want to equip your people with tools that would cause them to realize it's not really an us versus them issue. There's more to it than that. You don't want that. You just want to give them just enough to keep them under control and to keep them in a rather fearful state of mind. Fearful of the world outside, but fearful of you finding out that they might be like the world outside. That's the bad aspects of that form of fundamentalism. So that's where the King James, but then what's the Textus Receptus? Well, this is what's fascinating. I should have brought it with me, I just forgot to stick it in my bag, but the Textus, there is a group in London called the Trinitarian Bible Society. And the Trinitarian Bible Society publishes a little blue case-bound Greek New Testament, which if you go to any King James only Bible college, which are mainly in the South, you will find that if they offer Greek, that they will have this little dark blue case-bound Greek New Testament. There are no notes in it. There are no textual variants. It's simply the Greek text on the page. No English, it's not interlinear, but there's no indication of any variation in a manuscript or anything like that at all. And for the vast majority of people in the United States, that is the Textus Receptus. Now, where did that phrase come from? It came from an advertisement. Textus Receptus means the received text. It's a Latin phrase that first appears in 1633 in an advertisement by the Elsevier brothers, who were not actually brothers, they were cousins, but they're still called the Elsevier brothers. Anyways, they were a printing concern. They had put together this Greek New Testament, and in their advertisement for it, you advertised back then in Latin. Try advertising in Latin today. Not going to get you very far in our society anymore. But they advertised in Latin, and so they called it the received text, the Textus Receptus, and the name stuck. So what is this text that we have today, published by the Trinitarian Bible Society, called the Textus Receptus? Because there wasn't just a single manuscript that the King James translators used. There wasn't a single printed edition that they used. So what is it? Well, this is what's fascinating. Brilliant scholar by the name of Scrivener, right toward the end of his life in the 19th century, he put together a Greek New Testament based upon the textual decisions of the King James translators. So what he did is he took all of Erasmus, he took all of Stephanus, he took all of Beza, he puts them together, and then when they disagree with one another, he looks at the King James Bible, what did they decide? If there's a disagreement between all three, which one did they take? And so I think he used Beza primarily as his primary working text. And then when the King James would differ from the Beza, he'd go find out where did they get this from? Which did they get that from Erasmus, from the 4th edition of Erasmus, or did they get that from Stephanus? Where did it come from? And so he created a Greek text that mirrors exactly the King James Version of the Bible. So it's a Greek text based upon an English text that was based upon multiple printed Greek texts that were based upon basically less than 20 Greek manuscripts. We have 5,700 today. Because both Stephanus and Beza did try to bring in a few more manuscripts that they had access to that Erasmus didn't, but they didn't want to make super major changes. Beza did make one interesting change in his 1598. In Revelation 16:5, Beza made what is called a conjectural emendation. Conjectural emendation. What in the world is that? That's when you amend a text based upon conjecture. You don't have any evidence. You're just reasoning that this must have been the original. Now, why would he do that? Well, Revelation 16:5 talks about the one who is and was and ever shall be in the King James. Well, every Greek manuscript that Beza had access to did not say and shall be. It said the Holy One. Hasios is the Holy One. Shall be is esamenos, the future participial form of eimi. Elsewhere in Revelation, you have who was and who is to come type stuff. And so Beza's like, you know, it doesn't make sense that at this point it would say who is and who was the Holy One. And Hasios looks a little bit like Esamenos. They both end with the same two Greek letters and stuff. And so he made, though he did not have any evidence in a manuscript form, in his 1598 he put Esamenos instead of Hasios. Guess what's in the King James this day? Esamenos. Beza's conjecture. We have no Greek manuscripts anywhere in the world. Even what has been discovered since 1598. Nothing supports that. Every Greek manuscript of the book of Revelation says Hasios, the Holy One, not Esamenos. It's wrong. It's an error introduced by Theodore Beza. But it's still there. And if you're a King James only advocate, you've got to defend it. You've got to defend it. And the thing that really sticks in their craw is Beza was Calvin's successor. King James only advocates in general, the cultic kind, hate Calvinism. And so to defend Calvin's successor must be just really painful. But that's what they end up doing. And so this is the history that we're looking at. And this is where the TR came from. The TR is a English translation-based Greek text. All of the textual decisions in the TR were done by Beza, Stephanus, or Erasmus, but not consistently. And there is no Greek manuscript in the world that reads like the TR, identically. None. But there are many people who believe that is the text because that represents, well, just look at how much God has blessed the King James Version of the Bible. That was the exact argument that was being used against Erasmus when he changed the Vulgate. The Vulgate had been the Bible of the church for 1,100 years. And yet now you've got King James only advocates today who argue the King James has been blessed by God for 400 years. Same argument. Same argument. Back when the Vulgate was introduced, there were riots in Carthage because they were used to the Greek Septuagint. And Jerome, for example, when telling the story of the gourd that grew over Jonah's head, Jerome was living in Israel at the time. So he had access to better information as to what that specific plant was. It was a castor oil plant. And so in the Latin, he rendered it as castor oil plant instead of just a gourd. And when it was read in public, they rioted. Because we all know what it's supposed to say. It's what's in the Greek Septuagint. And then that supplants the Greek Septuagint. It becomes the traditional book of the Roman Catholic Church. And then when Erasmus comes along with the Greek New Testament and his own Latin translation, he gets attacked for that. And then that becomes the basis for the King James. And then when you come along and change that, you get attacked for that. It's just a cycle that keeps going on and on and on. Why? Because people don't know the history of it and don't realize they're going back and doing the same things that people before them have done over and over and over again. You've heard the proper line that those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. But the better continuation of that is that and great torture exists for those who know history and can't do anything to stop it. And that's sort of what I feel like in this situation, or watching what's happening in our country right now, where you're electing socialists to office without knowing what socialism has done only 50 or 60 years ago, because you're a iGener that doesn't read history and doesn't think it's relevant. They didn't have iPads back then, so who cares, right? No, anyway. That sermon was a freebie. So the TR is religiously presented as the final authority today. Now, what was interesting is if the few of you who may have seen the book that I did with Douglas Wilson on the textual basis of the New Testament, you will, if you remember, he actually, he was talking about the ecclesiastical text, and I emphasized in my opening statement, you've got to tell us, we need a specific text. And he knows, he's a very bright guy. He knows you can't point to the TR as it exists because he knows it's a secondary text. It's based upon the King James. So it says, you need to tell me what text it is that we need to be using specifically. I can show you an identifiable text here and say, okay, let's go here. You need to do the same thing. And he did. He did. It surprised me a little bit. I expected somewhat of a generally what you find in Erasmus, Stephanus, Beza, sort of, kind of, type of response. He just came back and said, 1550 Stephanus is the final authority. Yay, I have one. I didn't even know the whole time. I had the inspired inerrant version. It was sitting in my own studio that whole time. I could have been using it all that time. It's great. And of course, the problem was I then said, why specifically? And we didn't really get an answer to that because there is no answer to that. It's just sort of like dart, throw, Stephanus, there you go. That's all you can do. Why that particular one? Why not with the verse divisions? Why not with any of the edits that came out in the next? There's no way of answering those questions. But I am seeing more and more in Reformed churches. And I think it's a reaction against the degradation of our seminaries and the liberalization of New Testament studies, which is, every generation has this. Every generation has this. It's the way of the world, unfortunately. But it's sort of like we don't like what scholarship is doing theologically, and so we don't like what scholarship is doing textually either. And so we're just going to abandon all of that, and we're just going to go back to the TR. But the problem is, the TR came into existence before Sinaiticus and before every single papyrus manuscript that we have. And those papyri have taken us back to within a century of the apostles. Why on earth would we abandon that for a text that was based upon a tiny number of manuscripts, primarily from the 12th to the 14th centuries? And you have to come up with some kind of a theological assertion that, well, that's how God preserved the text, was in those specific kinds of manuscripts, rather than in the very manuscripts that were being used by people like Athanasius in defending the deity of Christ after the Council of Nicaea. I don't get any of that. I don't understand any of that. I don't see the foundation for that. And what I do fear is that it will end up decimating our ability to do serious apologetics. I don't see how either a King James only position or even a TR only position can engage in meaningful apologetic defense of the New Testament today. And that obviously is very close to my heart. We can take on the Bart Ehrmans. We can take on the Bart Ehrmans, and we can take on the Bart Ehrman students as well. But you can't if you're going to abandon the reality that God has given us His Word, and He's done so through history. He preserved that Word. How did He preserve it? In one particular manuscript family, in a re-inspiration of the Bible in 1611. How did He do that? That's what we'll get to in our last session this evening. Real quickly, and I think that's at 7 o'clock, right? Okay, so we got a little longer time for dinner. Quick questions. I've got about 3 or 4 minutes for what we've covered this evening. Yes, sir.
Slightly off topic, but going back to Jerome, your discussion of the Latin Vulgate. Why did Jerome prefer or choose the Stephen and Ray tradition over the Alexandrinus tradition? And the discussion of Augustine and how Augustine said it.
Because he lived in Israel, and so he knew, for example, he strongly resisted translating the apocryphal books because he knew the Jews had never accepted them as canon scripture. And since he lived in Israel, he had learned Hebrew, so he knew much more about the tradition of, well, it wouldn't have been the Masoretic text at that point. The Masoretes didn't flourish until another 400 or 500 years later. But what would become the Masoretic Hebrew tradition. And so it wasn't that he rejected the Greek Septuagint readings. He just felt that that's a secondary rendering. The Hebrew is the original. You go with the Hebrew original. And that did put him against the majority of the church of his day, which had accepted the obviously apocryphal stories of how the Septuagint came about. The story that circulated in the early church was that 70 or 72, depending on the version, scholars went into caves and translated the Greek Septuagint, and when they all came out, they compared their versions. They were all identical, word for word. And so that showed that God had inspired the translation of the Greek Septuagint, and so that gave it special authority. Originally, probably the story was they translated the Pentateuch, and they were all identical, something like that, but it grew over time. And so that was a popularly believed thing, and Jerome obviously was not one of the people who actually believed it. And so he gave the Hebrew text the priority at that point, and that has sort of stayed that way, and at least amongst the Reformed, they would point back to Jerome. Jerome would, I think, have been very upset to discover that his own translation, though altered over time, ended up displacing the Greek and the Hebrew in what would be the Roman Catholic Church. So much so that Pope Sixtus VI, I think, came out with an infallible Vulgate, which had to be withdrawn very quickly because of all the errors in it, but he did come out with one. So, yeah.
Would you think it would be fair to say, seeing things like, or what I've heard about things like, if we would have an Ark of the Covenant now, it would be worshipped at a certain place, that might be a reason we're, I guess we would say, to be glad that we don't have the original manuscript, because as you think, all these people like Catholics who just end up worshiping the Papyrus.
Yeah, I've heard that for so long in my life that once you hear something enough times, it sort of takes on a life of its own and sort of accept it as a given. I wouldn't mind if we had a couple original manuscripts. Might that happen? Well, I suppose. But I only jokingly point out that when we were getting down on our knees to read P46 in Dublin, that the security guards show up. They did show up. They did wonder what in the world we were doing. I guess that would look like we were worshiping the manuscripts, but we weren't. We were just trying to read them. Might some people have done that? I suppose, but would the value not be much greater to have those originals than a few people that would do something silly? I'll let some people do something silly if we can have the originals personally. I think that would be great. So, yeah, I've heard people say, well, that's why God did it. Well, I don't think we can say why God did it. You could say, that's a possibility, I suppose, but I'd rather just all the originals were discovered in a cave someplace, and oh, hey, we collected them. All right, all us textual critics are out of a job. All right, that's cool. Well, let's find something else we can do. That'd be cool with me. That'd be perfectly fine. Okay, so this evening, 7 o'clock is the time. We've got plenty of time between now and then, more than we had for lunch. And what we'll do this evening is we will dive into some of the key textual variants that King James onlyists will throw at you and say, see, it's right there. Can't you see it? Are you so blind? Has James White deceived you? And believe me, they say exactly that. And they normally tag me in Twitter when they're telling somebody else that I've deceived them, just so I know. See? Yeah. And so we'll throw accordance up on the screen. I'll blow the fonts up real big so we can see it all, and we'll geek out to some variants and then some practical applications. I think I heard some rain there for a while, so be careful as you're driving out there. Us Arizonans are not used to that stuff. We find it very strange that your sky leaks. You really should get that fixed. Ours is perfectly fine. It just doesn't ever do that at all, just about. So we will see you this evening at 7 o'clock. God bless.